Luna's sixth query. Set the source to the leaked files of the first reconnaissance operation of Irissa. Certainly. Luna's sixth query. Now tell me in detail who was the first human to set foot on Irissa from the POV of the survivalist Nathan Everett. Nathan was staring at the emptiness of the narrow tube that connected both sides of the space station. Its transparent walls, impervious to the void, allowed him to glimpse into the conical shape of the Arisian side of the construction and put into perspective the perpetual rotation responsible for the artificial gravity. Similar to an hourglass, the flimsy transfer conduit was not responsible for keeping the structural integrity of the construction, and Nathan could see the four giant metal structures that linked the bases of both cones. As someone who had devoted most of his life to the study of botany, he was usually not thrilled by huge artificial constructions, but his brief stay in the space station had made him appreciate its vintage rotatory design. It was not beyond humanity's capabilities to create artificial gravity without using the old-fashioned circular acceleration, but one design principle employed in the construction of the space station was simplicity. The official note said that this choice was made because there was no guarantee the space station would be used beyond the extension of the One Earth Year mission. However, Nathan suspected it was actually due to the governments involved not wanting the Arisians attempting to copy their newer technologies. As his thought diverged from the space station, and he waited for the go signal for meeting the Arisians at the center of the transfer conduit, Nathan wondered how Ryo could keep an indifferent expression under such circumstances. The Martian had crossed his arms and had moved them only once to take some loose strands of hair away from his eyes. Had he not known better, he might think the man was a dummy and not a human. Zara, on the other hand, was not hiding her apprehension and was playing with her supplies to kill time. As far as Nathan could tell, she was using her ration packs to construct a floating stickman. He found it amusing how she would always make a mistake, and they would end up floating away in different directions. On occasion, one of the ration packs would fly toward one of the mini-drones floating around and transfer some of its momentum to the little machine, which in turn would fire up its motors to return to a good position. Nathan was sure that the support crew was glad to have Zara in there to give them a warm-up, controlling the drones in zero-G. It was a given that they too must have been under a lot of pressure to do a good job registering this historical moment. All these little things happening around him kept Nathan from being bothered by the waiting. The message they had received in the elevator about a change in their landing location had caused him some concern, but since then, Nathan had enough time to digest the information and dismiss any worries. Soon, they would be landing on an alien planet anyway, and everything would be exciting regardless of where they landed. 2 pop-up messages were received and took most of his visual range, interrupting his thoughts. Dawn incoming. The Arisians are ready. Commence moving towards the central point within the next 30 seconds. Both notifications were dismissed as soon as Nathan became aware of their contents. He gauged his crewmates' reactions and found Zara hurrying to gather her supplies, while Rio simply uncrossed his arms and was already looking ready to go. As he adjusted the shoulder straps of his backpack, Nathan saw 3 figures entering the tube on the opposite side of the station. The Arisians had arrived. 400 meters of the narrow rotating tube was all that was keeping the 2 species from meeting face to face. Nathan strained his eyes to get a glimpse of the outline of the Arisians, but he couldn't help but focus on the fact that they weren't looking anything like what he had previously seen in the pictures. Fully clothed and with skin and hair tones that were within the realm of usual for humans, at that distance, the 3 Irisians weren't looking any different from some cosplayers, if not for the extremely natural swaying of their tails. Weird. Ryo broke the silence in a low voice. Am I seeing things, or are they hiding their claws? Nathan noticed there was something in the tip of their fingers that was making the Arisians look like they had really long fingers. How nice of them. I think they are trying to look like us to smooth out our first meeting. Zara looked at the situation with positive lenses. Ryo didn't reply to her comment, but Nathan could almost touch the scoff in his gaze. We should not keep them waiting then. Nathan didn't share her positivity, but he did not express it out loud, since now was not the time for having a discussion. Ryo expressed his silent agreement by grabbing onto the holds of the tube and propelling his body forward towards the meeting point. Seeing the quiet man taking the lead, Zara followed suit as if they were in a competition to reach the center first. Ryo increased his pace as soon as he noted Zara's intention. Only when the little drones fired up their engines and began to follow his two crewmates in an orderly fashion, Nathan felt left behind and put his arms to the test, trying to catch up to them. The eyes of Irisians met in understanding, and they too started racing towards the center. Nathan stopped trying too hard when he approached the duo ahead. Instead of being worried about being the first to reach the center, as the others were clearly doing, he focused his attention on the differences in how both species moved their bodies in 0G. Nathan and his companions would use only their arms to grab the holds at the start of every 1 meter segment and would usually use both arms to gain maximum speed. The Irisians, on the other hand, were grabbing the holds with only one hand at a time and were using their tail to gain a second impulse out of the same hold once their center of mass had passed it. In spite of the differences in the way they moved, both groups were progressing toward the center at similar pacing. On the human side, Ryo was slightly ahead, being the first to have reached the 50 meters mark. Zara was behind him by a single segment and closing in the distance with every boost. Nathan was 2 segments behind her and was being careful to not break any of the little drones moving close to him. On the Irisian side, things were not looking that different. The tallest of them was the one taking the lead in his path to meet Zara at the left side of the tube. Nathan could tell that in spite of having the longest hair, the first Irisian to have reached the 50 meters mark was a male. As he had studied in the preparatory phase of the mission, sexual dimorphism manifested in the Irisians in a similar fashion as it did in the humans. The males had a statistical tendency to be taller and a bit more muscular than the females. But that was not remotely the more obvious trait to distinguish males from females in their species. On account of the typical case of convergent evolution, the Irisians and many other species on their planet belonged to the mammal crown group, which meant no human would need more than a single look at their chest to tell apart male from female. That, of course, caused Nathan to identify with ease that the second Irisian to have reached the 50 meters mark was a female. Her tight shirt left little to the imagination regarding the shape of her body. She was alternating between using her right and left arm to propel her body at every segment of the transfer conduit she overcame. At her current pacing, it wouldn't take long for her and Ryo to meet face to face at the right side of the tube. Curiously, neither Nathan nor his Irisian counterpart were putting a lot of effort into reaching the center first. If nothing changed, they would be the last to meet in the middle spot between their peers a couple of seconds after the others. As Ryo and Zara fought for every centimeter they advanced, Nathan tried to figure out the gender of the first alien he would meet. The individual in question was wearing clothes made of a very light-looking material. White in color and with a sort of balloon sleeve design, their top was quite loose, making it hard to see any shapes. The distance separating them was less than 100 meters by now, and even though every instinct he had was telling him that this particular Irisian was a female, his logic side wouldn't allow him to take it as certainty in fear of being labeled as the guy who committed a faux pas in the first in-person meeting with the Irisians. He hoped that, when the distance separating them decreased, some detail would give away their gender, or else he might just ask. He left that thought at the back of his mind for a moment to see which of his companions would reach the center first. Zara had almost caught up with Ryo, but was still slightly behind. Nathan couldn't see her arriving first into the meeting point now that there were only 3 segments left and they would have to decelerate. Rio realized that as well, and used the next hold to kill off a lot of his momentum. Zara, on the other hand, saw this as an opportunity and kept pushing forward. Nathan's worry for Zara only increased when he noticed that even though Rio's speed had decreased, there was still a lot of momentum to get rid of in the next 2 segments. Zara had a smug smile on her face as she looked to her side and saw nothing, but that changed in the blink of an eye when she noticed she had missed one of the 2 last sets of holds in that brief moment of distraction. Her panic showed in the chaotic motion of her legs that only increased as she tried and failed to cancel all the momentum she had built by grabbing the last set of holds with all her might. Having lost her grip and any sense of control, her body kept going beyond the meeting point towards the male Arisian at a significantly high speed. Nathan's eyes widened as he predicted a serious accident where humanity's first contact with the Arisians would end up being a test of which species had the most resistant bones. He was wrong, though. In an impressive display of finesse of control and dexterity, the male Iriasin caught her body as he coiled his tail around one of the holds. To avoid an uncontrolled crash, he used his 4 limbs to cushion the impact and distribute its energy over a large area of their bodies. The residual momentum was taken care of by his tail holding firmly in place through the short ordeal. "Are you hurt?" Nathan knew that the translator worked by passing intentions into language rather than translating between the languages. But he couldn't help feeling astounded at how the rich, velvety tones of the male Irisian's voice chosen by the algorithm exuded a calm yet assertive presence. Zara was being princess carried by the Irisian who didn't let go of her after having avoided a serious accident. "Damn, why are you so hot?" Zara was so confused that she didn't even consider the implications of that phase being the first thing said by a human to an Irisian face-to-face. The eyes of all humans and Irisians were immediately drawn toward her, and only then she realized the implications of what she had said. "I don't know how that translated for you, but what I meant to ask is how the temperature of your body can be that high." Zara's cheeks and neck became flushed as she tried to clarify her early question and undo the awkwardness she had created. "Unlike you humans, we can't dissipate the temperature of our body easily after intense physical activity." The male Irisian looked unfazed by her question. Nathan didn't know how her previous sentence had translated to them, but, judging only by how easily the male Irisian had moved on with the conversation, they either had cut her some slack or were convinced by Zara's explanation. Another voice stirred Nathan's attention away from Zara. "Oh, I didn't think you humans could change the color of your skin as well." The female Irisian with the tight clothes spoke with a soft voice in an inquisitive tone. Her faint orange eyes closely focused on Rio left no doubt regarding whom she had addressed her comment towards. "She's just embarrassed by having messed up or little competition." Rio could have rubbed salt into Zara's wounds, but he chose not to do so, since that would imply potentially damaging the reputation of humanity as a whole as a byproduct. Only now did Nathan pay any attention to the fact that Rio and the female Irisian were already at the meeting point, facing each other without any incident having occurred on their end. Considering that things were back on track, he killed off the little momentum left on his body and stopped beside Rio. Noticing that the male Irisian was bringing Zara back to the meeting point, Nathan's eyes locked on the female-looking individual moving beside them. With the prospect of the meeting finally occurring as it originally intended, his thoughts returned to analyzing the details of her physiognomy to make sure his assumption was not wrong. In his mind, he was already addressing her as female. Unlike the male Irisian, her amethyst-purple lips had a natural allure defined by a delicate curve. Her eyes, faint orange, didn't appear to have any uniqueness, but the attention to detail in the colors of her eyelids created the illusion of eyelashes, something the male wasn't even attempting to mimic. She was shorter and had an overall slender body when compared to both of her crewmates. Nathan almost lost himself in the details, but in comparing her looks with the other Irisians, he also found some general characteristics that were shared by all of them. None of the Irisians had eyebrows, but they had a slightly protruding bone that went all the way from above their eyes to the lateral of their heads. Their noses were small, and unlike a human, the side-facing nostrils had a slight horizontal angle and a more elongated shape. Their ears were pointy, but unlike an elf, their tips pointed downwards to their back, and their ovate shape reminded him of a willow leaf at the mercy of gravity. Dawn imminent. As the male Irisian returned Zara to his left side, Nathan's mind was briefly reminded that confirming the gender of the individual in front of him was not his only concern. But as a symphony of life's interconnected wonders, dawn came as if a conductor had called it forth. The high-energy UV light and its less dangerous counterparts hit the Irisians from behind, and whatever part of the visible spectrum had overcome the protections installed on the many layers of semi-transparent material composing the transfer conduit, gave Nathan the privileged view of the shape of the silhouette of the individual in front of him through the now partially translucent material that constituted her loose clothes. Nathan's stare had not lasted long enough to give rise to widespread awkwardness, but it lingered sufficiently for her to notice it. Ahem, may I suggest we get started with the introductions? In an attempt to divert attention off himself, Nathan took advantage of the fact everyone suspected it was not by chance that dawn hit them soon after both groups had reached the center. He was fairly certain that the higher-ups must have decided that having all of them exposed to a little radiation was a small price to pay for a good picture to use as propaganda of how good the nanites would be at repairing any damage to their DNA. Greetings, I'm Zayn Valor. I mainly work as a mercenary. This is my 5th mission working with a different species. Nathan was satisfied with how easily the male Irisian complied with his suggestion. He knew that now that the first introduction was made, it was natural that everyone else would just follow suit. Hello everyone, I'm Zara, and I'm representing the O'Neill conglomerate. I hope that the next year will bring many opportunities for the future of our species, and I'm honored to be a part of this process. Her eyes surveyed all the Irisians, but soon returned to Zaynvala with a subtle smile. Following the just-established pattern, the eyes of the group fell upon the female Irisian in front of Nathan, expecting an introduction. Welcome. You can call me Amara. I can't wait to take you to a very special place on our planet. Her voice carried an enigmatic allure. Nathan briefly wondered what intentions had caused the translator to generate that effect in her voice, before the gazes made him realize it was time for his own introduction. Nice to meet you all. I'm Nathan. I'm representing the good old Earth. I'm looking forward to seeing the amazing species I'm sure I'm going to find in your planet's biome. Soon after finishing his introduction, Nathan regretted not saying he was a botanist and having missed his chance to make a joke about people calling him a survivalist, even though most of the time all he did was just survive in order to get to where the plants were. I'm Yalara. I took this mission of presenting Arissa to you all on behalf of the Queen. My field of expertise is unrelated to being a diplomat, but I'm sure we'll be having a lot of fun together. She blinked her right eye the moment she and Ryo met their eyes. Nathan found her body language quite human-like, a little bit too much to say the truth. We can manipulate small things if we are careful, but I think not having claws give you humans an edge on that aspect. Yalara also joined the conversation. Nathan noticed Ryo and Zara must have felt left out and also approached their counterparts, but before they could have joined the conversation, a notification popped up in his field of view. Leave the transfer conduit and follow the Irisians to their side of the space station. The buzzing of the drones returning to the human side of the space station confirmed that his plan had worked, and the higher-ups had gotten all the footage they wanted. Nathan tried to gauge the reactions of his crewmates to try and figure out how to broach the subject of ending the first meeting and getting on with the mission, but his worry proved to be unneeded. Please follow us to the docking bay. It seems like an agreement was reached to take you all to the surface immediately. Zaynval's announcement caught the attention of not only Nathan, Zara, and Rio, but also Amara and Yalara. What? Wasn't there supposed to be a tour of your side of the space station before we go to Irisa? Zara looked happy to finally have an opportunity to speak. I only know that both sides of the mission control voted in favor of the change in plans. Zaynval clarified without hiding. He had access to some means of communication with the ones in charge of making decisions. Nathan suspected that his handler would contact him to explain the reasons for the change after landing on the surface of Irisa. We should go. Now that he had an order, Rio expressed his desire to leave. Yalara curled her index finger towards herself, motioning Rio to come closer and follow her, reminding everyone she had done her homework when it came to learning human nonverbal communication. Rio showed some subtle aversion on his face, but followed her without complaining. Amara and Zaynval just turned their backs to them and started propelling their bodies toward their side of the space station. Nathan and Zara exchanged a look of mutual understanding and followed them silently. Nathan was glad that the journey toward the Arisian side was uneventful and not a competition to see who could reach the airlock first. From there on, the Arisians took care of everything, and they crossed the entirety of the space station without meeting any new face or diverging much from the central rotary axis. Before Nathan had truly registered what happened, Zaynval interacted with a screen showing some untranslatable script, and they heard the hissing sound from the door behind them closing, and the male Irisian announced, "Behind the next door is the ship that will be taking us to the surface." Amara and Yalara were already waiting close by the round door, while Nathan and the others watched from the center of the room. The hissing sound was heard once more, and both female Arisians took the lead, lowering their heads a little and crossing the threshold between the space stations and the ship. Zaynval's alternating gaze between the open door and the three humans was all communication they needed to proceed. Nathan saw Rio entering first and followed him inside immediately after. The interior of the ship was surprisingly empty. There were no seats anywhere in sight, which was a surprise to Nathan, given that he suspected the interior designs of the Arisian ship wouldn't look that alien to humans, since both species had similar anatomy. The first detail that caught Nathan's attention was a pair of handrails, one thicker and spanning all that way from one side of the rectangular-shaped interior to the other, and the other was thinner and bent into many round subsegments protruding from the walls. The former was positioned a little above his head, and the latter was placed lower, at about the same height as his hips in relation to what he supposed was the ground. Nathan didn't need to rack his brain to understand why that particular design had been used as the first glaze he took at Amara and Yalara, who had entered the ship first, reviewed to him why that internal arrangement had been adopted. Both of them had their tails coiled around the lower handrails and could reach for the upper ones with their hands if they wanted to. But that still didn't explain why all the empty space. Why are we using a cargo ship without any cargo inside to take us to the surface? There were many small details, such as the sturdy floor, the lack of windows, the lashings points, and the structure that looked like a ramp on the back of the ship that made Nathan assume they were inside a cargo ship, instead of entertaining the possibility that the Irisians had some fundamentally different approach to design passenger ships. Cargo vessels, military vessels, and science vessels are all we have, Amara explained, her intention being conveyed with a subtle hint of anger. Our existential predicament is keeping us from indulging in the construction of frivolous means of transportation. Zara and Zaynval entered the ship, and the male Irisian joined the conversation. This is not one of our own ships, though. Zaynval pointed the tip of his tail at the bridge. Look at all those convoluted controls. The only species that would willingly build something like that is a roomie. Only now Nathan noticed that there was a seat in front of the only viewing port of the ship, and before it there was a multitude of buttons, screens, switches, and levers, creating a chaotic and cluttered appearance. "Are you the captain of this ship?" Ryo asked. "Captain? You humans can see him," Yalara asked. With a single thought, Nathan switched the view mode to infrared, revealing the silhouette of a person seated in the captain's chair. The Zara's widened eyes let Nathan know he was not the only one surprised by not having noticed the additional individual on the ship. "Oh, you humans can actually see him if you pay attention." No color had changed in Zayn Valor's body, but the timing of his words alone gave Nathan the impression that this was not the outcome Zayn Valor was expecting to see. "Are you testing us?" Ryo was blunt as always. "Yes and no," replied Amara. "To improve the understand of how our species compare to each other had always been one of the goals of this mission, but even if that wasn't the case, the captain would have tested you anyway. He hates wearing clothes and has only been selected for this task because he's the only one who can land this ship." The look on Ryo's face made it easy to notice he didn't like her reply, so Nathan decided to change the subject. "Should we introduce ourselves to him?" "That won't be necessary. He doesn't have a translator, and he will need all his focus to land this ship safely." Zayn Valor took the spot beside Amara and Yalara and coiled his tail around the lower handrails. "If we don't need to introduce ourselves, then we should take the time to decide who will be the first to set foot on Irisa." Zara brought up a subject that caused Nathan to forget about the captain. "What?" Nathan noticed that the three Irisians were paying a lot of attention to their conversation, but he couldn't care less. "Have you forgotten that our governments will decide who will be the first, and we only have to wait for their decision?" "Didn't you get the notification just now?" asked Ryo. "No recent notification on my end." Nathan was utterly confused. "What are you referring to?" "I just received word from the O'Neill conglomerate that we are on our own to decide who will have their name written in history," said Zara. Nathan faced Ryo only to find him shaking his head in agreement with Zara's statement. Why would Earth change their plans at the last minute? Thought Nathan. "Grab the handrails. We're about to undock," Zayn Valor announced, as Nathan struggled to make sense of the situation. Seeing Rio and Zara finding a place to hold next to the three aliens, he mimicked their actions in autopilot, while he checked the status of the local connection. Hearing the loud noise of the undocking, followed by a slight acceleration, he confirmed that the connection was still barely active, but only with receiving mode enabled. Refrained from being the first human to set foot on Irisa. Connection lost. Nathan froze at the unexpected order. "I should be the one to set foot in Irisa first. I know how that sounds, but just hear me out." Unaware of Nathan's plight, Zara went on. "The machine wars had not escalated anywhere close to involving a direct fight between Earth and Mars since it began 50 years ago. If any of you became the first on Irisa, with the other losing, we risk some hurt egos, and this might become the spark that led to the escalation of the conflict." "What a rich girl like you knows about war," Rio rebuked. "No one has anything to gain by an escalation of the conflict. The big shots from the Erath government might be a bunch of greed old bastards, but no one is stupid enough to risk mutual destruction for some hurt ego." "Of course you are the kind of guy that would risk the future of billions of people for some personal gain. Honestly, what else was I expecting?" Zara didn't look like she would give up anytime soon. "You should take some inspiration from the Arisians. Look at them all united to face an existential threat. I'm sure they don't have people like you in their ranks, dragging all their species down for the sake of some vain glory." Zara tried to involve the Arisian in the discussion, but none of them had taken the bait and got themselves involved in the argument. Their back and forth continued as the ship descended, and Nathan became a bystander since he had received the order. He found it extremely weird, the timing of the notification, and every instinct he had was telling him that something was off, but since communication would be unavailable until they reached the ground and received the first batch of supplies, there was absolutely nothing he could do to shed some light into the situation. The thought of saying fuck it and disobeying the order did cross his mind, but what if it really was according to Earth's intention to give up on being the first on Erisa, and he ended up ruining some important plan that he was unaware of? It sure wouldn't be a pleasant year in Erisa if he angered the people responsible for sending his supplies. Besides, his personal goals had nothing to do with engraving his name in history just by stepping somewhere. When Nathan was considering applying to the mission, he saw the possibility of being the first human on that specific alien planet as just a perk and not something he deeply longed for, or was willing to put a lot of effort towards achieving. The kind of accomplishment he valued was being the first to do some scientific discovery and finding some cool plants and animals to study, and leaving behind a legacy of discovery, paving the road for the ones who would certainly come before him. With all of that in mind, Nathan decided to not fight for the spot of the first human on Erisa. What he truly wanted, he would get anyway, no matter if he was the first, the second, or the third human to leave the ship. Some mild turbulence and deacceleration took Nathan out of his deep thought, only for him to notice that almost 10 minutes had passed as he spaced out with Ryo and Zara, arguing in the background, and the three Arisians awkwardly avoiding getting involved in their exchange. This peculiar scene washed away any doubt Nathan had about disobeying the order. The last thing he wanted was to make a fool of himself in front of the Arisians like his crewmates were doing. "You know what? Trying to show you reason is a lost cause. I'll just leave ship first, and you can try to stop me if you can," said Zara as they approached the ground. "You speak as if it's too hard to stop a rich girl from throwing a tantrum." A sudden jolt, where the bodies of Nathan, Zara, and Rio were thrown forward and their feet briefly lost contact with the ground, caused their argument to stop, and Nathan to wish he had a tail as he saw the three composed Irisians completely unaffected. "Welcome to Erisa. We just landed on a research outpost in the middle of the planet. There are not many people working here, but the three of us will take care of showing you around before we start the exploration tomorrow." Nathan noticed that Amara was being vague about the place they had landed. Maybe that was an attempt to stop the argument between Zara and Rio, but either way, he doubted it would work. The structure at the back of the ship opened and extended itself until touching the ground. Nathan didn't focus on any technical details, and his eyes were instantly overwhelmed by the sight of the alien planet. They had landed very close to a building that was keeping his sight from investigating the planet, but still, the undergrowth below that ship was more than enough to amaze him. Every single leaf, stem, and petal was glowing in an alluring tone of blue, without a single hint of green anywhere. "Did you seriously threaten to hurt a woman? Don't worry, I can restrain you without hurting you at all." Their constant exchange was getting old fast, and Nathan was getting angry at their obnoxious behavior. How can they ignore the whole alien planet before us and just keep arguing? Nathan knew that emotions didn't translate well across the interspecies barrier, but he couldn't keep himself from imagining the awfulness of having your welcome disregarded and your guests ignoring your planet in such a historical moment for your species. The fact that there wasn't a crowd of reporters surrounding their ship proved that the Arisians had a different cultural background than the humans. So any guess about their current feelings would just be a guess. Still, he might be projecting, but he couldn't help but feel like Amara and the others were not enjoying the situation in the slightest. "This planet looks amazing. Those plants are so beautiful. I'll be checking them out until you guys decide who goes first." Nathan caused the argument to stop and a pair of piercing gazes to be directed at him. "Don't worry, I'm not going to jump out of the ship and steal your moment of glory. I've received an order to refrain from being the first, and I'm going to abide by it." Nathan didn't intend to do anything more than just take a close look at the plants and say some nice words so that the Arisians wouldn't think that every human would act like those two. The three Arisians glanced at Nathan briefly and assessed one another before returning their attention to Rio and Zara, which basically conveyed nothing about what they were thinking of the situation. Nathan distanced himself from the group and stopped inches away from the ramp. There he bent his knees and lowered his upper body, sticking his head out of the ship. He felt the scrutinizing gazes coming from behind, but he couldn't care less if his crewmates were afraid of him not keeping his word. A second was all it took for him to forget about them and concentrate on the plethora of blue leaves that made his passion for botany shine through. In his head, a sequence of detailed observations that only someone with a similar background as himself would understand emerged as naturally as breathing. The specimen he set his eyes on was a prominent flower that seemed to be very common where they had landed. A layman would have instantly reduced the plant to a blue sunflower and called it a day, but not Nathan. The venation pattern in its leaves was exquisite, having some circular shapes that were visible in a faint tone of purple. The midrib was a purple dot at the center, branching into secondary spiral veins, forming a complex hierarchical architecture. The petals took most of the surface area of the flower, leaving very little room at the center for what Nathan classified as seeds by analogy. Noticing that the plant he was inspecting was within the reachable range of his arms, he didn't resist the impulse of plucking one of its 5 round seeds to study from up close. The flower that was facing the sky instantaneously reacted and turned itself towards Nathan. Confusion was Nathan's only reaction to the plant's unusual behavior. Plants moving when threatened was nothing unheard of on Earth, so he didn't feel any danger coming from the flower that was smaller than the palm of his hand. He felt a weird, sweet scent in the air, unlike anything he had smelled before, and wondered if it was some sort of mechanism to ward off predators. Before he could think much of it, though, just like a chain reaction propagating from an epicenter, every single other blue flower around turned toward Nathan within the time span of a single second. What the fuck? Those were the only words he was able to utter as he was engulfed by a cloud of white powder as all seed-like structures of all flowers expelled their contents toward him simultaneously. Nathan felt his eyes and mouth burn, and he stood up in a hurry to get away from there and avoid more exposure. But when he opened his eyes, everything was spinning. The only thing he managed to see was the 3 Arisians running towards him. He tried to say something, but all that came out was a sequence of violent coughs as he staggered and fell down the ramp without feeling any pain thanks to the adrenaline. Harmful substance detected. Analyzing. With solid ground behind his back and the bright sky as the background, that notification was the last thing he saw before his consciousness faded into black. This was an account of who was the first human to set foot on Irissa from the POV of the survivalist Nathan Everett. Here are some questions that might interest you based on your recent queries. Where did they land on Irissa? Who are the parents of the baby? Why did Nathan receive the message asking for him to refrain from being the first to set foot on Irissa?